Welcome to Dialogue. The U.S. has just doubled the tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25% to 50%, a move that has ramped up pressure on global steel producers and has drawn condemnation from around the world. In Canada, the top exporter of steel and aluminum to the U.S., the Prime Minister's office called the move unjustified and unlawful. How are nations around the world responding to the hike? How will this impact U.S. steel production and U.S. consumers? And just where is Trump's trade war heading? Join us for discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor John Gong from University of International Business and Economics, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics from East China Normal University, Professor Joav Toker from American Graduate School in Paris, and Radhika Desai, Director of Geopolitical Economy Research Group. Welcome to the show. Radhika, we'll start with you. Canada is the largest export, let's say, in terms of steel and aluminum, especially aluminum. So tell us, what's the understanding of Trump's doubling of tariffs of steel imports, 25% to 50%? What's behind his idea?
Lots of people have tried to find a method in Trump's madness, or what seems to be Trump's madness. And they're trying to say, what's the logic? And every so often you hear some elaborate or read some elaborate account of what the logic might be. But in reality, there is very little logic to what Trump is doing. There are 3 or 4 sets of pressures under which he's operating. On the one hand, in order to win this election, in order to win it by getting the votes of a substantial number of working class voters in the United States, Trump has essentially said he's going to make America great again, restore American industry by using tariffs. Tariffs alone will never restore American industry. This idea that imposing tariffs will magically reindustrialize the United States is rubbish. It has been discredited by lots of people. So that's one pressure under which he's operating. The second pressure is, of course, he totally enjoys the fact that every time he makes these announcements, he has companies of U.S. companies and countries internationally coming around to him, trying to plead with him not to do this, that, or the other. A third pressure, of course, and I should mention that there is this new term that's been invented, Trump always chickens out. So, every time the markets react badly to Trump, then Trump changes his policy. So that's why you have this yo-yo of policies. One day there are tariffs are imposed, next day they are relieved or postponed, etc. So that's a third set of pressures. And finally, there is this whole issue that his own administration is divided between those who are for all-out trade war, presumably the sort of the MAGA camp, and then others who represent the actual interests of companies that are invested all over the world, that trade with all over the world. And they will, of course, have, they will be, so these two groups will be giving conflicting advice to Trump. Mm-hmm. And I suppose one final point, which is that, which I haven't read that this has affected Trump, but prices will go up, inflation will go up, and this will seriously endanger the whole US system, because if the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to deal with inflation, he will prick the financial bubble. If it does not raise interest rates to deal with inflation, inflation will continue. So all of this is putting everybody, including the US economy, in a very bad position. And of course, rising uncertainty, my God, I mean, that in itself is actually the killer, not this or that tariff, but rising uncertainty. So above all, if you consider all these things, there is absolutely no method in what Trump is doing.
Right. Professor Mahoney, I mean, of course, he talked about jobs. He talked about, say, national security. And does he really see, say, steel industry is of national security? And of course, like everything is now is national security. And of course, reindustrialization, he talked about a little bit. So what's your understanding of his doing it now on Wednesday?
Well, I agree with several of the comments were just made, but I'm not entirely certain that he still really cares that much about the campaign promises that he made. In so much as, he doesn't have to worry about getting reelected. But he does have to worry about Congress getting reelected, assuming that he wants to continue to have comrades, Republicans dominating both houses of Congress. That said, I think Trump is in a bind. On the one hand, he's rhetorically committed to the word tariff, and he's certainly yo-yoed. He's gone back and forth with it, and he's been able to extract some deals, some benefits, and he may still force some sort of deal with Canada or with the EU. Clearly, there's a desire for deals to be made on their part. Whether or not they can come to terms that they find agreeable remains to be seen. But nevertheless, he remains committed to this because I think he's fundamentally opposed to the other strategies that countries might use to deal with steel prices, which are low. Which is, a number of countries band together and create some sort of coalition between them to ensure that prices are protected and their industries are protected. And some people suspect that he might be creating that type of pressure ahead of the G7, so that might induce some sort of deal there. But nevertheless, he is a unilateralist. He prefers to avoid multilateral relationships, and so he may just let this run for a few weeks, see how the markets move, see what sort of concessions he can extract from other countries, and if it gets too painful, back up.
So strategic ambiguity, right? Uncertainty.
Well, I think so, but I think the bottom line is he doesn't have, given his ideology, this Jacksonian ideology, which is significantly driving, I think, a lot of the decisions so far or tactics being used, and given the fact that he's so rhetorically committed to tariffs, he really has no other alternative in front of him than what he's doing. But again, we've seen broad retreats on tariffs. We saw what he did after the meetings with China and Geneva. We've seen the U.S. Trade Court rulings. So it's really sort of difficult to know to what extent he's trying to induce deals, to what extent he's looking at long-term tariffs. I don't think he's under the illusion. I don't think he's seriously under the illusion of reindustrializing the United States. I do think he is looking for some sort of short-term gains.
Okay, Professor Toker, I mean, of course, EU is one of the largest trading partner of the U.S. and also the source of export of steel and, in particular, steel, I would say. So, what's the attitudes from the EU? From the last round of 25% on steel, they prepared, countermeasures. And are they ready to, fight back?
Well, this is what, the leaders and the spokespersons of the EU are saying over the last few weeks, because that's the minimal thing you may be able to say in such an awkward situation. Because obviously there is no method in so-called Trump's method. It is the lack of method which is the basis of the system. Now, we have already understood that to some extent during the first mandate of President Trump, before he regained the Oval Office 4 months ago, it is reinforced over these last few months, right? Now, the fact that there is no method or there is very little efficiency, if you wish, in the efforts to try and figure out something which does not exist by definition, one should state that the basic elements are create pressure, inject confusion, and then opportunistically judge upon specific moments in the come and go with the partners to the negotiations, and just try to cut the best, localized, domesticated on the instant, and the figures and the conditions which would seem at that moment to be the most, the maximized from the point of view of the White House, right? Now, as other partners, practically all other partners around the world of America, he's not using this lack of method, but he's following mainly, the more conventional criteria, with figures, with comparisons, with projections. And as America has this huge market power due to the size and impacts of its own economy, we are into this. Shall we call it a method? No, it isn't a method. It's a state of affairs, right? Out of which President Trump will try to get the best opportunist deal, and then, of course, say that this is a victory.
Yeah, well, of course, bilateral approach to U.S. Is poised that they can take advantage in that position. John, of course, U.S. versus Canada. Canada is the largest exporter of steel to the U.S. Let's say 22%, and aluminum. Canada is the dominant source of the aluminum, 53%. It represents the U.S. import there, and basically larger than the next 10 or more combined partners of the United States. So what will Canada do? Canada, it seems to be in a, let's say, a weak position, given how powerful the U.S. is in terms of their market and economy here.
Well, first of all, let me say a few words about the statement made by the Canadian government. It says it's unlawful. What it really means is it's unlawful under the WTO framework. The GATT agreement, if I remember this correct, I think it's Article 26 or 21 or 26 regarding the national security issue. And I think the excuse of invoking national security for the steel and aluminum case clearly doesn't apply. It doesn't conform to that article. That article really talks about strategic or materials for making war, that kind of thing, for nuclear weapons, stuff like that. So it's not even remotely related, I think. Nevertheless, I think I have sort of a different theory about the motivation behind this. Now, if you look at the first time during his first administration that he imposed a steel and aluminum tariff, pretty much under the same excuse of national security. It turns out that this is really for the interests that the Trump administration has with the steel industry. And for some reason, Trump has always been very fixated on these old industries, steel, aluminum, coal industry. At the time, his Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, is deeply, deeply involved in the steel industry. I suspect this time there's something similar happening here as well. I mean, this is not going to encourage foreign investments into America to make steel, aluminum anytime soon, in the short run at least. I think what it does is just going to beef up prices, protect the domestic industries, and he may be doing this for himself or some of his rich friends tied to the steel and aluminum industry. I think there's going to be a windfall for these companies given such high tariffs, and pretty much it's going to shut off all these imports into the United States, of course. Now, the question about what Canada can do, I honestly, I don't think Canada can do much other than making a very tough statement. And given the prospect of the G7, I don't think that G7 is going to unfold very, very well, given Trump's very strong position against the European Union, against Canada on a range of issues. So I think the question about Canada, very limited things can do. I think Canada will be very happy to remain as an independent country, not the 51st state of the United States.
Radhika, of course, last round of 25% of tariffs on steel and aluminum, and you can see the U.S. Basically steel shipment to the U.S. from Canada have fallen 30%, and now people have this fear. Now tariffs being doubled, of course, probably the U.S. market will be closed for them. But at the same time, with that said, they say electricity accounts for about 40% of the cost of smelting aluminum, and estimated that replacing Canadian aluminum with American production would require the expansion of U.S. power generation equivalent to 4 Hoover dams. basically, at least in short term, that's just impossible.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is, I only mentioned earlier the amount of time it takes to set up a steel mill or an aluminum foundry or whatever. But the fact is that there is also these further up the line capacities that you need to have. So again, to make sense of this is really very difficult. I agree with partly with what John said, that he's probably, there's some powerful interest in steel and aluminum industry involved. But I should say that Trump is not the first to impose steel and aluminum tariffs. I mean, I remember very well George Bush Jr. In the early 2000s imposing steel and aluminum tariffs, because steel and aluminum are very basic industries. They are the basis, the foundation of industry in most countries. So I think that there is, the combination of considering you can't lose steel capacity, etc., and then for these interests and the influence that they exert. And these interests have always been fairly powerful. So there's that. And then I should say, also that Canada really finds itself in a very, very difficult situation, because over the last 30 plus years, since 1988, when it signed the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, it has it has essentially decided to ignore everybody who was saying that over the previous decades, Canada's imbrication, Canada's intertwining with the US economy is increasing to alarming levels, to levels that put in question Canadian sovereignty, etc., etc. These people were there, but essentially all of this was ignored. We signed the free trade agreement, then NAFTA, and then, of course, Trump tore off NAFTA, and we have this UMSCA or whatever it's called now. But the thing is that Canada exports a very, very high, like 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. So it and Mexico are in a very, very difficult situation. And so Carney basically won the election by riding on a wave of Canadian nationalism that had emerged. As you read in the papers, Canadians have stopped visiting the United States. They're not buying, as far as possible, American products, etc., etc. So he rode this wave, but quite frankly, I think he's going to find himself in a very difficult situation. So he's still trying to keep up this act of this tough rhetoric, but looking for some kind of a deal which will allow, which will not destroy the Canadian economy, because that is the danger that is being faced. So I think that I don't think Carney is that sort of person. He's not a sagacious necessarily leader, but nevertheless, if you had a really sagacious leader, they would try to reach with whatever short-term agreement the best they could manage with the United States, while in the long run reorienting Canadian trade away from the United States, because it's not just about Trump. I think the situation that got Trump elected in the United States is not going to go away anytime soon.
Not going to go away anytime soon. But I know it's hard to make sense, Radhika. Briefly, Mexico, if you take a look at the statement from their economy minister, basically said that, it makes no sense for the U.S. imposing tariffs on a product in which you have a surplus. Basically, the U.S. export more steel to Mexico, but now they are imposing tariffs on the Mexican products. So of course they are trying to seek exemption from the U.S. We don't know whether they will get it, but anyway, can you make any sense about the tariff on Mexico products here?
No, and as you say, in all things considered, the United States is a great beneficiary of its trade relationship with Mexico. So the way in which it is being treated, gets cheap products. It has its companies invest there or have trading relationships there, which allow them to import cheap things. But then the United States, if you look at the U.S. In general, I think the United States has, many would argue, benefited from its trade relationships with the rest of the world, and the fact that there will be inflation now as a result of these tariffs, whether they last or not, the uncertainty that has been created is bound to have some effect. This is going to affect the United States badly. So whether you have a trade surplus or a trade deficit, it doesn't matter. The question is, how do you, like you just don't do it in the way Trump is going around doing it. You want to renegotiate your trade relationship with Mexico, by all means, do it in a serious and mature fashion. But that is not what we see happening happening in Washington. Yeah.
Right. Professor Mahoney, Wednesday, of course, when this doubling tariff first starting to work, is also the time when the United States would like, their trading partner to submit their proposal for deals with the United States in order to avoid this Liberation Day tariff from taking effective in about 5 weeks. And their U.S. trade our office, USTR, has sent a letter to their partners to give them, quote, a friendly reminder that deadline is upcoming. What do you make of that? There's only one preliminary deal with the UK in the pause time of 90 days. So it's like the prospect is not that optimistic?
Well, I think, we may see, I agree that Canada is under a significant amount of pressure. And although he was elected for standing strong, he is going to find himself facing incredible pressure to try to work something out with Trump. Although I don't think anyone really trusts the prospects or the deal that comes from that sort of arrangement, rather that he's an opportunist, and any moment that he has to extract more benefit, he'll do that. Canada and Mexico know that better than anyone else. I think there's still some optimism that there might be a deal with Europe, although it's difficult to imagine right now, in so much as Trump has, stated repeatedly that he sees the EU as basically a conspiracy against American interests. That may just be rhetoric, but nevertheless, that's where things are. But still, I think the EU is in a position where they will face considerable pressure to come to some sort of terms, given all the other challenges they face vis-a-vis the U.S., including the conflict in Ukraine, the security trap, and vis-a-vis NATO, and all these other issues.
Professor Toker, given this popular saying in Wall Street, charcoal man, Trump always checking out, you think, EU is different from Mexico, Canada, in the sense of like how strong the economy is. It's the largest economy in a sense. And will they stand firm and reach a fair deal with Trump?
Well, we have to keep in mind that the case of the European Union is unique in this sense in comparison to other partners, because we're speaking about 27 countries, right? And of course, there is a very significant dimension which Trump tries to exploit. That's legitimate, over the fact that to get 27 economies agree on specific ways of advancing in an anyway very complicated set of negotiations is a huge ambition, right? It never worked perfectly well over the history of the EU, and there's absolutely no objective reason it would work better this time. However, the level of confrontational energy, let's call it politely, which comes from the direction of the White House, makes it, shall I say, easier or at least more natural for the Europeans to coordinate their positions in a way that, say, perhaps negotiating with a so-called conventional American president or any other negotiable partner would not be. So the Europeans have already worked on it, and the formal rhetoric position, which we hear about in Berlin and in Brussels and in Rome and in Paris and in Madrid, is that Europe is ready, and Europe will be tough, and Europe will invent and imply methods and means in order to counter the American aggression, if you wish, right? Now, to what extent would that hold when it comes down to specifics? I'm not sure, because the 27 do not have the same kind of trade with America, and certainly not when it comes to steel and aluminium, right? Cannot compare, say, the German or Italian share in this market and the Belgian and the Portuguese.
The different countries, different consideration there. John, of course, we know that the purpose, at least a spoken purpose of Trump's tariff is to protect the jobs in the steel sector, for example. But at the same time, of course, more tariffs, that means taxes on the U.S. consumers, downstream factories there, they will see increase of prices, increase of cost to produce any products. So maybe one job saved in the steel factory, but probably more jobs lost, or could be, in the situation in this downstream factories, in the chains. So is protectionism really justified, or what kind of effect that will have on the U.S. economy if, just go ahead with 50% tariffs?
Yeah, well, I think we have to take a general equilibrium approach to rigorously study this issue. What is the real net effect of this tariff on steel and aluminum? You're absolutely right that at the same time it is protecting the industries themselves. There's going to be implications for the downstream industries, negative effect for the downstream industries. I remember reading a paper, quite many years ago, talking about exactly this issue. Taking a sort of a general equilibrium approach to the Bush tariffs that Radhika was talking about earlier on the steel industry. And I remember, if my memory serves me right, I remember saying that the net effect is actually negative for these Bush tariffs. The Bush tariff eventually actually was also sort of watered down after a WTO ruling. It wasn't that severe as the first round Bush imposed these tariffs, but nevertheless, the impact is actually not so much positive for the U.S. economy, although it's a very small impact by all means. This time around, I would expect the same thing actually. The United States domestic steel industry isn't large anymore. So even if you protect that industry, you're not going to save a lot of jobs. You're not going to create a lot of jobs either. America doesn't even have its own steel company anymore. I think the largest steel company, American Steel. This is the iconic brand of the steel industry in America, right? American Steel as a company was sold to a Nippon Steel, Japanese company. So it's a dwindling industry anyway. And the way he treats it as if it's a big deal. So I think at the end of the day, your question about what is the net effect on the U.S. economy, before kinds of studies were popping out, I would conjecture that it's going to be negative for the U.S. economy.
It's a negative effect. With that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.